If we're living life in relationship with other people, we will experience conflict. The pause tool will help us make peace, not just keep the peace. Avoiding conflict may keep the peace, but over time, resentment can build and cause an even greater conflict. Or it can damage the relationship long term. Scripture shows Jesus had conflicts with others, and he didn't avoid conflict. We see him speaking truth, and often it conflicted with the Pharisees' way of teaching. When the Pharisees asked questions to trick him, Jesus didn't run and hide. He answered with great wisdom. And when accused of blasphemy and condemned to die, he made peace for us forever by his blood shed on the cross. Regardless of whether we are ever called to sacrifice our lives for another person, peacemaking and reconciliation are essential functions of Christ's followers in living out what Jesus modeled. We want to turn to Matthew 5 and Matthew 18, where Jesus gives us some core principles for how to resolve conflicts between believers, centered around confession and forgiveness. First, Matthew 5, 25 through 26. Jesus says, if someone sues you, settle things with him quickly. Talk to him as you are walking to court. Otherwise, he may turn matters over to the judge, and the judge may turn you over to an officer, and you may land in jail. I tell you this, you will not emerge from prison until you have paid your last penny. So it's important for us to work outside of the court as far as possible. Next, we look at Matthew 18. We'll look first at verses 15 through 17, and then verses 21 and following. Jesus says, this is what you do if one of your brothers or sisters sins against you. Go to him in private and tell him just what you perceive the wrong to be. If he listens to you, you've won a brother. But sometimes he will not listen, and if he does not listen, go back, taking a friend or two friends with you. For as we have learned in Deuteronomy, every matter of communal import should be testified to by 2 or 3 witnesses. Then if your brother or sister still refuses to heed, you are to share what you know with the entire church. And if your brother or sister still refuses to listen to the entire church, you are to cast out your unrepentant sibling and consider him no different from outsiders and tax collectors. So it's important to go to someone in private if you have a conflict with them. And then starting in verse 21 and 22, Peter asks, Lord, when someone has sinned against me, how many times ought I forgive him? Once? Twice? As many as 7 times? And Jesus tells Peter, you must forgive not 7 times, but 70 times 7. So many times, forgive and forgive and forgive. And Jesus goes on to tell a parable about a master whose servant owes him a large amount of money. And the servant begs for time to repay that debt. And not only does the master consider giving him time, the master erases the entire debt. Well, that servant turns around to another servant who owes him a fraction of what he owed the master and demands it back immediately. The other servants see what happens, and they go to the master distraught. And the master is so upset with the servant. And Jesus tells us that we will be forgiven in the way that we forgive others. We have been forgiven so much, so may we forgive others as well. So the pause tool will give us a way to talk through conflict in a way that allows for cooperation instead of competition. It works ideally when both parties are wise. Remember the wise, foolish, evil video that we watched earlier in our time together. So what we're going to do is we're going to turn to 1 Corinthians 13. And we're going to let love guide us in resolving conflict. In 1 Corinthians 13, the very beginning of verse 4, it tells us love is patient. So the first thing we want to do whenever we experience conflict is we want to prepare. Don't just jump in. Fools rush in. Prepare. Take time to pray. Read scripture. Seek godly counsel. Ask God to help you better understand the other person, the situation. Ask God to help you know what specific points you should address when you do talk. And ask Him to know when you should talk, where you should talk. There are so many things you can be praying about to prepare for that initial time of meeting together. If we continue moving on in 1 Corinthians 13:4, I'll call it B, although the very first part is so short. It says, love is kind, not rude, or jealous, or proud. So, for this second stage of the pause tool, we want to affirm the relationship. Consider what this relationship means to you. How much do you value it? With gratitude, tell the other person what it means to you. Perhaps you can share that you've been feeling tension or been unsettled since whatever happened between you, whether it was a situation, a conversation, and that you'd like to try to better understand one another. Be sure to not let sarcasm creep in here. And it helps to assume that there are feelings and pieces of the puzzle that you know nothing about. So assume that there is more that you can learn. With that being the case, 1 Corinthians 13:5 is going to help us. Love does not demand its own way. We want, write that down there. Love does not demand its own way. It is not irritable, and it keeps no records of being wronged. So we want to understand and then be understood. There are other parts of the story. And if we can slow down, we can understand those. We can have a chance to hear them. In any situation, what your perspective of that situation is what is true to you. That is what you saw, that is what you perceived, that is what you experienced. But the same is true for the other person. What they saw, what they experienced is also what is true to them. And so when you can stop and ask questions and allow them to fill you in what they perceived to be true in that situation, you can gain a better understanding of why they're feeling how they're feeling. In that, practice reflective listening. If you hear them saying some things, then repeat back. It seems like you're feeling X, Y, and Z, and this really caused you to get defensive or whatever the issues are. But reflecting back gives you an opportunity to make sure that you're correctly understanding what they're trying to say. As you're listening, you can identify their concerns, their desires and needs, their limits and their fears, and you can find common ground in those too. What of those are shared concerns, shared fears, shared desires? You can share the ones that you guys both share in common, and be able to build from there. If there are many conflicts that are going on, several situations, if this is built for a while, you may need to start with a smaller issue, an easier issue first before tackling something larger. 1 Corinthians 13:6 is going to lead us into the next step. Love does not rejoice in evil, or about injustice, but rejoices whenever the truth wins out. Can the truth win out if we're working together? Absolutely. This is where we can seek creative solutions. Perhaps take a moment to pray beforehand and ask God to help you have some creative ideas. Let it be prayerful brainstorming. Hopefully, you can both come to a conclusion where you can both win. Maybe you don't both win with 100% of what you're wanting, but you don't want to focus on a solution where one person gets almost everything they want and the other person gets almost nothing that they want. You want to focus on solutions that can offer mutual benefits. Be creative. Don't necessarily count an idea out just because you're just brainstorming. Throw them all out on the table, and then perhaps you even combine potential solutions to come up with something that works well for you. That gives you opportunities to use those ideas. And then 1 Corinthians 13:7 says, love never gives up, never loses faith, always is hopeful, and endures through every circumstance. I'm only going to put the first part on the paper, but we want to fight for a relationship together. We do not want to settle. So, in this last stage, evaluate openly and honestly. Does the solution work for you? Both of you. If it doesn't, then come back to the drawing board. Perhaps in the time that you've been testing that solution, maybe the Lord has given either one of you or both of you some other ideas of things that may be a better solution. That's okay. Try something new. Perhaps you even need to get some professional opinions about whatever situation you're dealing with. Perhaps you need to dig into some Bible passages about that particular conflict. But just be honest with one another and fight for the relationship. Fight for one another, knowing that your relationship is going to be way more important than either one of you being right, so that you can pause and you can make peace.